I think it also, lends itself a little bit to kind of the personality of a lot of people that come to work in Washington, D.C. We probably have, more valedictorians of high schools here in D.C. than most cities in the country today. And so, a lot of people, they want to be the smart person. They want to be the smartest person in the room. They want to be the person that understands things the best, but that doesn't mean you're the most effective at explaining it. And I think that, to me, that, the reason we have language is to be understood. And the reason we have advocacy is to be understood and be able to kind of move the needle on certain things. And so, a lot of times it's not about being, the wonkiest person out there. It's about being the one who's most effective at delivering a message.
Welcome to another episode of Chief Influencer. I'm your host, Anthony Shop, co-founder of Social Driver. Washington is the center of influence in the US and arguably the world. Chief Influencer spotlights leaders who have figured out how to break through in today's fragmented and noisy environment. Social Driver teamed up with the George Washington University College of Professional Studies and Communications Board to recognize these leaders as chief influencers and highlight how they inspire and influence others. I am thrilled to introduce today's guest, Jeff Farrah. Jeff is the Chief Executive Officer of the Autonomous Vehicle Industry Association, the unified voice of the AV industry. Before we dive in, here are a few things I think you should know about Jeff. Number one, he's a tested association leader with significant management and operational experience, including executing on strategies to increase association growth, revenue, and impact. Prior to leading AVIA, Jeff served as general counsel at the National Venture Capital Association, so he is no stranger to innovative technology that requires significant investment. During his tenure there, NVCA prevailed in several key policy campaigns for venture investors and VC-backed companies. Number two, Jeff also knows how Washington works. He served as counsel to Senate Majority Leader John Thune during his tenure as chairman of the Commerce Committee and as general counsel to Senator Scott Brown. During the 2012 presidential election, Jeff was a member of Senator Mitt Romney's Trade Policy Advisory Committee. And Jeff is passionate about the promise of autonomous vehicles to deliver a world that is safer, provides greater mobility to those in need, and eases supply chain challenges. He's regularly called upon to testify before policymakers in the U.S. Senate, House, and in many state capitals. And he's widely sought out by policymakers, transportation experts, and the press to discuss autonomous vehicles. Jeff, you have been called a tested association leader, a Washington insider, an autonomous vehicle expert, a legal advisor, an expert coalition builder, and even a translator. Today, we are thrilled to call you a chief influencer. Welcome.
Anthony, thank you so much. It's a very kind introduction. I love what you've done with the podcast, and I'm very, very pleased to be with you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm so excited for this conversation today. And as we start, I just have to confess something to you. I hate driving and ride sharing has been an amazing change in my life. But when am I going to be able to just give up my driver's license for good thanks to autonomous vehicles?
It's a great question, and it's a question that I get pretty often. And I think that certainly a lot of members of my family have put a lot of pressure on me to try and see if we can deliver autonomous vehicles to their neighborhood on an expedited basis, because I think there's a lot of people that either don't want to drive for choice reasons, or they can't drive for a variety of reasons, and they feel that autonomous vehicles are really part of their future. I think in terms of when it is going to be widely available in every American city, that's a little bit hard to tell. But you've really seen tremendous amounts of incremental progress, especially in the last 5 years, where you've seen a lot of autonomous vehicle companies that have been rolling out deliberately, kind of city by city. You've certainly seen this with the robotaxi companies, where you think just a few years ago it was really only in San Francisco and in parts of Arizona. You've seen additional deployments in Los Angeles and Austin, and announcements in Atlanta, and announcements in Miami and whatnot. And so it continues to make that progress. And so I think in a few years here, we're going to see a huge amount of coverage in major metropolitan areas across the country. So Anthony, I'm hopeful that at some point you can get rid of that driver's license, but you might have to be a little bit patient with us.
Okay, I'm happy to be patient. I can't wait for it. And I guess I'm probably not alone in being surprised by how quickly things have changed. And I wonder, some of our listeners may not even realize how far along this technology is. I remember reading headlines, I don't know, several years ago about, they're doing these tests in San Francisco, and it felt like a really limited thing. And then not that long ago, I saw a post on social media from a friend of mine in San Francisco, talking about how they're using, Waymos like all the time. Like it's just like me hailing an Uber or a Lyft in many of the cities that I go to. And I guess it kind of struck me like, oh, this is actually people. It's like regular consumers are doing this right now, and I it kind of surprised me. And so I don't know how many people would be surprised to know that they can just go to San Francisco and just do this right now as part of the regular course of business. Can you just talk about how quickly this technology has advanced, and also, what that means for how you communicate this out to policymakers and the public? Do you find that folks don't even realize that this is a technology that a consumer can just use in many cities right now? Is that a surprise to folks who haven't been to those places?
Yeah, I think it is a surprise to a lot of folks, depending on where you live in the country and certainly where you live in the world. It's definitely not an overnight success. I'll tell you that much because you talk about 10 to 15 years of testing, of just tremendous amounts of capital investment that's gone into these companies to really get to the spot that we are. But I think for a lot of people, they do think that we're still in this testing phase, or this is something that is aspirational, that might be here someday, or maybe it's even science fiction and it's something that you might see in a movie or something like that, but it's not actually going to happen. And the reality is it's on our roads today, and we actually have collected some data from our members, and what we were able to produce as AVIA is to show that our members alone have driven more than 70 million autonomous miles just on
Wow.
US public roadways. So that's 293 trips to the moon and back. It's 29,000 trips across Route 66. So these vehicles are here. They're already on the roads, and that's just the autonomous miles on U.S. public roads. It doesn't include the amount of testing that goes on in tracks or in simulation or things like that. And so this is something where it's very much here. I think that the robo taxis tend to be the ones that are really the most visible to a lot of Americans because if you go to San Francisco or you go to Phoenix or go to Los Angeles, you see these vehicles that don't have a driver in the front left of the vehicle, and there are people just sitting in the back seat right now. And I've been a passenger in many autonomous vehicles in my time with AVIA, and it's been an extraordinary experience. And so this is something where those tend to be the ones people are most aware of. But the other piece of this that's going to be coming much more into the forefront of Americans' minds is on the trucking side, where freight right now, a lot of leaders are thinking about how it is they can move freight autonomously, and they're partnering with leading autonomous vehicle companies. And so you see places like in the state of Texas, which has really become the global leader on autonomous trucking, where a lot of investment has gone into a lot of the operations there. You have partnerships that are being inked. You see companies that are announcing that they're going to be going driverless here in 2025. And so that's something that's really the next frontier that you'll hear about.
It's so incredible just to think about how some of these things that maybe we dreamed about are becoming a reality. And you're in a position where you have the opportunity to get that message out to folks. And I want to kind of ask about the way you get that message out and how things have changed, because a lot of the leaders we speak with, they have to balance controlling information and controlling a message with the fact that in today's world we don't have as much control as we used to, because somebody can share something on social media and just get it out there. It's hard to embargo things the way we used to. So when autonomous vehicle technology was new and it wasn't happening out on the road, you probably had policymakers and reporters scheduling a demo where they could get the right information and talking points from you all or your members. But now they can just show up in San Francisco or one of these other cities and do it themselves. And I'm wondering how that's impacted the way your industry approaches communication, since like so many things today, it can't be as tightly controlled as it once was.
I think it's a great observation, and I'll say that now that you can summon a robotaxi in many American cities, using Uber or using Lyft or using the proprietary apps for the companies, you have journalists that are taking their own rides, and they're trying to get their own experience and then reporting out about it. And I think the really great thing about it is it's a very authentic experience. This is not something that is orchestrated by the company. The journalist is going out, and he or she are grabbing a ride and sharing their observations, and by and large they're great stories, because again it has that authenticity so people realize this is actually something that is safe and exciting for them to get into. And the same is true for policymakers, whether they're regulators at the federal level, the state level, or certainly members of Congress. And we hear with regularity of someone who didn't go through the company to get a ride, but said, hey, I was in Phoenix, or I was in San Francisco, and I wanted to take a look at this and try it out. And I got in the back seat and found out it was actually pretty boring, because that's kind of the impression a lot of people get the first time, where maybe the first 60 to 90 seconds for them is slightly terrifying, and then you realize that this autonomous vehicle is a way better driver than you would ever be. It's far more conservative. It obeys all the traffic laws, and then you forget really quickly that you're even in a vehicle that is effectively driving itself. And so that's the way the experience should be, and we're going to continue to see this normalize.
That's great. I guess that's like a lot of innovations. It's like really exciting at the beginning, and then it's kind of boring. And that's a good thing, because that means that, it's being adopted and can scale. So your organization, AVIA, you're the unified voice for the autonomous vehicle industry, and you represent the world's leading technology and trucking, ride sharing, automotive, and transportation companies. I know it's not always easy to get so many organizations on the same page. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about how you build consensus and manage the different business interests of your members. Obviously, they have things that, they all agree on, but then, they have divergent interests, I'm sure, too, just like any organizations do.
Yeah, we have a very broad membership when you think about, we're talking about just one technology, because really when you talk about autonomy, there are so many things that are going to be able to be done with this fundamental technology. And obviously in the robotaxi space, we've talked about, that's a big one, the trucking space, and freight and logistics, and ride hail. And so you have many different types of industries that all see autonomous vehicles as playing a part in what it is that they're going to be trying to do in the next 5, 10, or 15 years. And so we bring them all under our umbrella at AVIA, and we represent all of them. I think in terms of trying to drive consensus, I think that, from my perspective, when I kind of went down this path of being in the association world, I vowed not to be boring. I vowed not to be least common denominator. And for me, when I was a staffer up on Capitol Hill, it was the meetings with the associations that were just very vanilla, very milk toast. You couldn't get a sense of kind of, what the actual specific policy was. It was very top line. I just said to myself that I would never do that. And so I've tried in both my association jobs to really do that, and to press the envelope, wherever I can, and to do a lot of the hard work in advance to try and drive consensus. Is it always easy? Absolutely not. It's not. And sometimes you think that you're not going to be able to get to a certain outcome. But ultimately, if you do put in the work, and you try and bridge the divide, and you try and make sure that everybody understands that the organization is representing this entire ecosystem, that we all ultimately want the same things in terms of making sure that there's a sound federal policy framework to support autonomous vehicles, that you have really great state policy as well. That this is something that, as long as you're all rowing in the direction, you can generally work out all of the different specifics. And so, that's something that we don't take that for granted. And, it can be challenging at times, but I think that ultimately, what you see is that, your impact is far greater, and you become a reliable source for policymakers turning to you to say, how can I help to pitch in on this? How can I solve this issue? How can I write that bill, write that letter, or come up with that regulation or whatnot? And so I think that's what we've kind of built our reputation on at AVIA, and we're very proud to do the work.
This episode is brought to you by the George Washington University's College of Professional Studies. With in-person and online programs ranging from master's degrees in public relations strategy to certificate programs in digital communications, GW offers more than just the credentials to help working professionals get ahead. It prepares them to be leaders in their field. I'm a proud GW graduate myself, and I can attest that the faculty members combine academic rigor with real-world lessons that can't always be found in textbooks. Check out cps.gwu.edu for more information. When you talk about your experience, being on the Hill and being the recipient of advocacy, and obviously you've seen a lot of, advocacy that's not necessarily the most effective, and you've learned from that. But you also just talked about being the reliable source of information for policymakers. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. Okay, we have to be trusted. We have to be reliable. We want to build that trusted brand. And then at the same time, we can't be boring, and folks will, not pay attention to us. So I'd love to hear a little bit about, just a deeper dive on that, what you've learned from your experience being on the other side of it, and now being a leader within two associations, your current one being AVIA, so that we can kind of hear some of the best practices that you've applied.
Yeah, I think that, the first thing is that it's really important to kind of meet people where they are and understand what is it that interests them, right? If you look at policymakers, they generally have a backstory that should make them interested in autonomous vehicles, right? They might be representing constituents that are farmers and ranchers and manufacturers that want to be able to get goods to market. And they look at autonomous trucks, or they might represent people in a city center where they're elderly, or they're people with disabilities, or they're individuals that don't can't afford vehicles, or don't have vehicles, or can't drive for whatever reason, and they see the mobility and accessibility angle. And so you can generally find a direction that someone is really going to have an appeal towards autonomous vehicles. And so you have to paint a picture for them. You have to make sure that they understand your vision of the future. Why the heck is it important that we make vehicles drive themselves these days? It can't just be because it's cool, or it's interesting, or because we can from a technology perspective. You have to paint this picture of why this is a fundamental shift in how transportation is going to look like, and why is it that a member of Congress, or a member of that person's staff, or a regulator should stop what they're doing currently and instead enlist themselves in your cause, and ultimately take a lot of action on your behalf. And so I always try and put myself in those people's shoes. And I think that, when I was working up on Capitol Hill and other jobs, I certainly didn't see a lot of advocacy groups try and put themselves in my shoes. A lot of times it was very, me as an industry trying to explain, oh my gosh, this new regulation is going to cost us a bunch of money, or it's going to be such a pain for us to fill out all that paperwork, or, some other type of, parade of horribles that goes on. And I'm not saying that all those things are completely unjustified, but they're ultimately not that persuasive when you think about the fact that policymakers have a huge amount of responsibilities, and they have a lot of other things that they could be focused on. And so unless you take them on your journey as an industry and as a cause, and explain to them why you're the thing that they should be focused on, you really don't have any chance. I do think there's a lot of associations. I don't mean to pick on my other associations in Washington, but there's a lot of other ones that I think that, that's fine. They just kind of keep on keeping on, and, send letters, and occasionally will, show up in person. But if you really want to be effective, you've got to figure out what makes them tick, and you have to figure out how to explain it. And then ultimately you have to give them an exciting proposition to be for it.
I'd love to hear a little bit more on that storytelling narrative. As you're talking to, again, could be policymakers, it could be reporters, could even be the public, about the story of autonomous vehicles and like what this can do for people. What are some of the go-to messages that you use? What's the narrative arc that you think about that helps people see that it's not just, me, why your industry wants it, but what's in it for them as well?
One of the things that we've done is to really invest a lot of time in and we call our partners program, which is really allied organizations that are very interested in autonomous vehicles. These are groups like National Federation of the Blind and American Council of the Blind, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, Institute for Safer Trucking, United Spinal. These are all groups that their core work is not around autonomous vehicles, but within their constituency, they see a lot of hope for from these vehicles in terms of what their constituency can do. And so I think that that's always really useful in articulating the why of what it is you're doing. I'm a big fan. There's a TED talk by a guy named Simon Sinek, and he says that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it, right? You can't just show up and say, here's my widget, buy my widget. The best companies in the world, they're explaining like, why is this widget so important? Why is it critical? Why do you need to have something like this? And I think that in the lobbying world, in the advocacy world, it's very much the same thing, where you have to kind of, take them again on that journey of explaining, why it is that autonomous vehicles are so important. And I think that, those allied organizations that I mentioned, they help to really demonstrate that, this is not just something that is just a neat thing to do if you have the spare time to ride an AV, but, if you're a person, that is a person with disabilities, and you're not able to drive a vehicle yourself, and you want to be able to open up new economic opportunities for yourself in this country, an autonomous vehicle can be really a great new proposition. Or, I think of people like my 93-year-old grandmother who, fortunately she has family in her neighborhood that can still take her to the grocery store and do all the things she wants to do, see her friends. But for a lot of people, that's not the case, and they're really homebound, and it's very, very unfortunate and sad. And you think, if there was only a way that people could have more mobility far after they're not able to drive a car themselves, that's going to be the hope. So we really try and spend a lot of time, investing in that space, and I think it's been quite effective.
That's great. As we talk about sort of the benefits, I mean, one of the benefits obviously is this can save a lot of lives
Mhm.
because there are so many traffic accidents. But I was thinking about Walter Isaacson's biography of Elon Musk. And there's a story in there where Elon Musk believed that the overall reduction in deaths from should well that should be the focus when evaluating the safety of self-driving vehicles. And he argued that, despite potential accidents involving AVs, that the key comparison should really be against the much higher number of fatalities in human driven cars because there's so much human error. But his team had to sort of remind him in this story in the biography that public perception is going to generally focus intensely on individual incidents involving new technology like for example a self-driving car, which overshadows the broader safety improvements. And I think this is kind of a typical example of speaking to the head and speaking to the heart. Even if you have a statistic that something's better, one emotional story is going to be the thing that's reported on and the thing that everybody talks about. Did you hear this? And so I wonder how you think about this challenge and how you influence different stakeholders, knowing that this is something that you have to deal with. When you have any sort of innovation or new technology, you just know the way people are going to tell that story and interpret that story.
Yeah, I mean, the story you're referencing, I mean, it makes me think very much to my previous job in the venture capital industry, where in the VC world, you get a lot of people that are coming from an entrepreneurial background or a scientific background or a finance background, so they're very numbers driven, they're very data driven, and so a lot of times you talk to a venture capitalist about some kind of an advocacy initiative or a regulation or whatnot, and their first response is like, well, let's just show them how much the economy is going to grow, or show them how many jobs it's going to create, or show them how much is going to save Medicare or Medicaid. So it's a very kind of data driven answer of like, let's just present the data, and like that should take care of it. And I can remember being in many conversations going back where it's like, that doesn't carry the day in Washington. You're kind of white noise when you're throwing up numbers. And I wish I had a nickel for every trade association that had a white paper on how many jobs they're going to create over some period of time. It's just something that is done. It's kind of table stakes. And so you do, as you say, kind of need to also make sure you're speaking to the heart as well. And so we certainly find that in the AV industry. And I could give you any number of data points about the 40,000 people that die every year on our roads, and the fact that the overwhelming cause of these crashes is impaired driving and distracted driving. And those are all useful data points, but ultimately, those are ones that are very data driven, and you need to have more if you're going to ultimately, prevail in a lot of these fights. And, I think the scenario you just mentioned with Elon Musk and Walter Isaacson, is a great example of that. And I think that, Secretary Buttigieg has said very much the same thing, which is to say that, if you did cut in half the number of deaths that were caused by humans in this country, from 40,000 to 20,000, and the reason for that cut was because you had widely available autonomous vehicles, the story wouldn't be autonomous vehicles cut roadway deaths in America in half. The story would be autonomous vehicles harm 20,000 Americans, and people would be focused on that new number instead. And so I think it's just something where we acknowledge as an industry that we are held to a higher standard. We know that we're far safer than human drivers, and that's why this industry continues to progress. But we need to always be building that trust. We need to always be far better than the human alternative, because otherwise, we'll be trapped in this situation where people are just outraged the machines are doing things on the roads, and then we'll be set back.
I like that reframing too of how Secretary Buttigieg said it. Um, you've served, Jeff, in a number of roles inside and outside of government. Um, so much of what you've done in your career is about influencing others. I wonder if you could talk about, what skill or skills have you developed that have most helped you in this quest to influence others?
I think that one thing that I always try and remember is a constant struggle for me to try and put myself back in my old seat as being a Senate staffer and think about what it was that I was influenced by, what it is I didn't like, what I did like, and that's something where even talking to you today, Anthony, it's a good reminder for me to kind of always struggle back to that spot and make sure that I am trying to remember the things that ultimately matter. I think that beyond that, I mean, people, need and deserve to be treated with respect. And certainly, if you can disagree without being disagreeable, I'm a huge belief in that. I know that our politics has kind of taken a different direction in recent years, and that's unfortunate from where I sit because I believe in being a bridge builder and believe in trying to reach out to people. And then, the kind of closer related, area is trying to be, as really systematic as you possibly can about identifying, who the persuadables are, who are the people that you really, at the end of the day, kind of need to have on your side. Because, with something like autonomous vehicles, there's going to be, some subset of policymakers that are always going to be for you. And there's others that are going to be always against you, and then there's big chunk in the middle that are people that are really fair game, and they're the ones you kind of need to go after. And we are by no means a huge trade association by Washington standards, and so we need to make sure we're choosing very wisely where we put our resources. And so that's why we tend to fight smart as we possibly can, and that's something that we've I think been very successful at.
Another thing that I think you've done that, I've heard about and we've talked about, and you've demonstrated really well in the conversation today, breaking things down, is playing the role of a translator.
Mhm.
I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, because that seems like a superpower when it comes to Washington, having to take, something about technological innovation or scientific breakthroughs or whatever it is, and finding a way to make that relevant the way that you've described.
Yeah, I think this is actually a lesson that I think I really got when I worked for the Senate Commerce Committee. And the Senate Commerce Committee, when I worked there, and as recently as this year, it tends to tilt quite rural in terms of like the states that it represent. And so I was working on technology policy, and but you had a lot of states that were represented that weren't necessarily at the forefront of technology, but they were big agricultural states and things like that. And so I remember doing one of the very early hearings on what the fancy term at that point was the Internet of Things, and we had lined up some great witnesses, but the star witness was this person who came that was basically using Internet of Things technology in farming and dealing with water use on farms, and he was the one that many of the members of on the Commerce Committee were really interested in hearing about. And the reason for that was that as much as they were interested in technology, what they really needed to care about was their constituents and what this meant to their daily lives, and being able to have that anecdote so that 6 weeks in the future they're back at a town hall in their hometown, and they're able to say, I learned about how technology is helping us to be able to manage water use on farm and in irrigation and whatnot. And so that was a eye-opening moment for me to kind of think about, okay, it's not about being able to understand the fanciest technology and be able to articulate this at the level of a scientist or level of an investor. It's about being able to take that understanding and then put it in a context that works for the people that ultimately are the ones that you need it to work for. And so back then I was working for the committee, so I needed to kind of put it in their context. And so even now I do my very best to try and understand as much as I possibly can from a business technology perspective, but you need to be able to filter out a lot of that information and kind of leave it out of your explanation. Because if you take people down this rabbit hole where you're giving them all these kind of nerdy pieces of information, we've all seen that look on the other side of the table where the eyes just glaze over and you realize like, okay, they're just being polite, but they're not really listening to what I'm saying. And so I try and come up with ways to explain technology in a way that I think makes sense. And so that's one where I don't get it right the first time. A lot of times you need to iterate and realize, okay, that didn't work. I need to reframe that. And that's where you need to lean on colleagues and lean on other people in the industry to try and say, hey, help me with this explanation. Help me try and understand what would make somebody kind of see through that and have that memorable piece.
I really love that way of thinking, Jeff, but I also love that specific example, because I'm sure a lot of folks are thinking, when they're communicating with policymakers, like, the folks that graduates of the Graduate School of Political Management at GW, and they're trying to get a message out to a member of Congress or their staff, they're probably thinking, okay, what's the thing I need to say that's going to resonate with that policymaker? But if you think, what's the way I can say it, that they'll take that and they'll repeat it because they need things to say. They're going to go home at that town hall meeting. I mean, if you get the person to repeat your example multiple times, that is reinforcing it in their mind at a much deeper level, and then they really are becoming an advocate for you. So it's a totally different way of thinking about it versus like, well, what's the thing that I can say for this one person to break through? That seems like a really savvy strategy on influence, and I bet it's something that works really well when you're thinking about folks going back to their district and talking about the importance of autonomous vehicles too, right?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think it also, lends itself a little bit to kind of the personality of a lot of people that come to work in Washington, D.C. We probably have, more valedictorians of high schools here in D.C. than most cities in the country today. And so, a lot of people, they want to be the smart person. They want to be the smartest person in the room. They want to be the person that understands things the best. But that doesn't mean you're the most effective at explaining it. I think that if, to me, the reason we have language is to be understood. And the reason we have advocacy is to be understood and be able to kind of move the needle on certain things. And so, a lot of times it's not about being, the wonkiest person out there. It's about being the one who's most effective at delivering a message.
So when it comes to AVIA and the work that you're doing right now, I know over the years there have been some bills proposed about autonomous vehicles that haven't moved forward. Can you talk a little bit about the work you're doing now? And is this the Congress we're going to see some legislation pass?
I am super optimistic that 2025 is going to be a great year for our industry. We have a new proposal that just came out at the beginning of January called Securing American Leadership in Autonomous Vehicles. This is our new federal policy framework that provides fresh and bold recommendations up to the Department of Transportation and up on Capitol Hill for ways to move forward with a federal policy framework on autonomous vehicles. What's really happened in the last 10 years or so, when you've had different bills up on Capitol Hill that haven't gotten over the finish line, is you've seen a lack of action from the federal government, but you've seen a lot of states race ahead in terms of legislating in this space. Whether people know it or not, we actually have 25 U.S. states in the United States that have authorized autonomous vehicles on their roads, and that represents 56% of the U.S. population. You could run freight autonomously from Arizona all the way to the coast of Georgia or Florida going west to east. You could go from Texas to North Dakota going south to north. So you've got a huge swath of the country that has taken action. But those states, they're limited in terms of the types of actions that they can take regarding AV policy. And we really need the federal government to really step in and regulate and legislate in this space. And so, we really took the time in the fall, early winter of 2024 to dust off old proposals, think anew about where the industry was, where are we from a technology perspective, from a commercialization perspective, from an industry initiative perspective, and what do we really need to kind of take the next step to make sure we have American leadership on the AVs. And so that was really the work that culminated in this new proposal, Securing American Leadership in Autonomous Vehicles. And it really goes back to what I said at the outset of this podcast, which is that you've got to do the hard work in advance to get there, because now we're in a spot where we've got this exciting new proposal we can just hand to people and say, let rip on this. This is something you can do. This will ensure the United States leads on autonomous vehicles in the 21st century. If instead you started that conversation, after the president was inaugurated, then you'd be, sitting around trying to figure out what you were for well into the spring. And so we didn't make that mistake, and hopefully we'll be the beneficiary of it. Last thing I'll just say is that, there's very early indications that we're in a different climate now, because you had Sean Duffy, who's the president's nominee for Secretary of Transportation, who was up at the Senate Commerce Committee just this week. And Mr. Duffy very, very clearly articulated his belief that we need a federal framework on autonomous vehicles, that he wants to lead on this. He wants to establish rules for the road. You had 4 members of the Commerce Committee asking him about it and also echoing the same sentiment. And so this is something where we do think there's a lot of momentum on our side, and we're very optimistic for this year.
That's great to hear. Before we wrap up, I want to just ask a question that's maybe a little bit more internal facing. So you're actually the first CEO of AVIA, and you've had a chance to build a new organization that wasn't like many associations, maybe beholden to decades of this is how things have always been done here. I wonder if you could talk about what you've learned building a new organization and a culture.
To me, it was one of the most exciting aspects of taking this job was being able to kind of come in and really set things up in an appropriate and strong way. And so, there have been some work before I got here. We actually got our birth as being a coalition out of a law firm, and then it grew into being an association. And I have been fortunate to lead it the last 2.5 years. And so, for me, being able to kind of come in and establish the processes and the culture and the norms, that's been a super rewarding aspect of the work that's gone on. Because I do think for a lot of associations, they've been around for a very long time, and changing programs that have been in place for a long time is a very difficult thing. It can be done, but there's always the resistance of, well, this is just the way that we've always done it. And so there's not that many opportunities to come in and build something really new. And I think that, we have progressively built out our communications infrastructure, our state policy infrastructure. We're active in all 50 states as well as in the federal government. We are trying to build out industry initiatives. We've built out engagements and a council with law enforcement and first responders. We've engaged in public trust dialogues and whatnot. So it's really been extraordinary, the amount of things. And every once in a while, I kind of turn around and think, gosh, we've really accomplished a lot in a relatively short amount of time. So I think it's all appropriate, especially for an industry that's so forward leaning. When you think about autonomous vehicles, obviously it's very much at the forefront of American technological innovation, and so we need a trade association that can match that.
Well, congratulations on what you've achieved in such a short time. And as I said at the outset, I'm a big believer. I can't wait till I get a turn in the driver's license, thanks to the work that you're doing. For folks who are really interested in learning more about AVIA or about you, where should they go?
They should go to theaviaindustry.org. They've got all sorts of great documents there, information there. We're also very active on X and on LinkedIn. If you want to see these vehicles in action, you can go places like San Francisco and Los Angeles and the greater Phoenix area, Austin, Texas, and then a few other cities in 2025. So this will be something where we'll continue to make steady progress. And obviously we're very keen to bring it to a city near you.
That's fantastic. I can't wait to take my first ride. I'm gonna do it soon, I think. Well, Jeff Farrah, thank you so much for being with us today on Chief Influencer. Really appreciate you sharing your story and lessons from your incredible career.
Anthony, thank you so much for having me as your guest.
Chief Influencer is a production of Social Driver. We help clients transform complexity into clarity with people-centered strategies. Whether you're looking to elevate the influence of your brand or your leaders, check out socialdriver.com to learn more. For show notes or to nominate a guest, visit us at chiefinfluencer.org or follow Chief Influencer on LinkedIn.